All right, so we'll get started, and I expect other people may join us. We've enabled the transcription, so if you need that service, please feel free to use it. And you'll note that, as usual, we are recording this session. My name is Nadine Trépanier-Bisson, and on behalf of my colleagues at CPCO and at DFO, I'm really happy to bring you this webinar today. For those of you who have been with us since the beginning, this is a 3-year project. We are in year 3, and this is the final webinar of a series of 3. So this is the final piece for this team together with Stéphane, who has been part of most of our webinars so far. So really grateful to have you join us with this last webinar. And as usual, there'll be an email package that will follow tomorrow or the day after. You'll notice that Sarah is not here today. Sarah has moved on from OPC to another position, and we are really happy for her. We have Noah with us. So Noah is one of 2 individuals who provide some tech support for us. So if you have any technical issues, feel free to put that into the chat, and Noah will be able to help you, hopefully. He can resolve a lot of issues, but sometimes it's nothing that we can do to help. So we're happy to do that and to learn with you. And so I am going to turn it over to, I should say before, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or use the Q&A function. We'll be using both of those towards the end. If you have some questions, we may also be able to, because if this is a fairly small group today, we'll be able to, if you raise your hand, we can have you unmute, and you can say your question verbally if you prefer that. So with that, I'm going to maybe, Janine, since this is the last one, I know that you're on deck, but perhaps we could give an opportunity for you to introduce yourself, and then Jose and Judith, and then launch into the webinar if that works. But I'm turning this over to you, Janine, and you can manage it how you feel is most appropriate.
Wonderful, thank you, and good afternoon all. And I think that is a great idea. I'll take the opportunity to introduce my 2 colleagues to introduce themselves. I apologize for the background noise. It will be gone shortly. My name is Janine Small, Central Liaison Principal with the Toronto District School Board, and I'm happy here to support you. And I will turn it over to Judith.
Hi everyone, I'm Judith Desjardins, Principal with the London District Catholic School Board, currently on secondment with School Mental Health Ontario. Happy to be part of this team and happy to be with you today. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is José Landriot, and I am a principal with the Conseil Scolaire Viamonde, and I've been part of this team for the last 3 years, and it's been wonderful, and I represent ADFO on this project. So it's wonderful to be here today.
Thank you for that. And it's my pleasure to welcome participants from ADFO, CPO, and OPC to this 3rd year of a 3-year series to support school administrators to better support students with autism. During our 3 years, the first year we explored themes of understanding autism, implementing inclusive leadership, and working with parents and caregivers to support students. In year 2, we continued our learning by exploring executive functioning skills, working on interdisciplinary team, and creating a safe and caring school environment. All of these webinars, recordings, and resources can be found on your association webpage for you to access and review. And before we go any further, I'd like for us to start with the land acknowledgement, and Judith is going to walk us through that.
Thanks, Janine. So let's begin our time together. Let's take a moment to center ourselves where we are. And if you're comfortable, you can put into the chat where you're joining us from and on whose lands you are joining us from. So let's use this quiet as an opportunity to respect and appreciate the different territories from which we work and live. To think about those who came before us, who cared for this earth, the land, the water, the birds, the fish, and the animals. I recognize my privilege in joining you today from St. Thomas, Ontario, along the shores of Lake Erie. I'm honored to live as a settler on this land that was cared for by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, Ojibwe, Chippewas, Indigenous peoples. This land is covered by the Upper Canada treaties. I enjoy the deep ravines of St. Thomas and the many birds and animals that find shelter within the ravines. I use the waters that once served as a passageway as for my own enjoyment when I use my paddleboard in the nicer weather. I reflect in gratitude for the generations of Indigenous peoples that cared for this land, a place that I call home. It's important to acknowledge the need for truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples, to name and to address the historical and current wrongs so that we can work on making them right. And I do this in my own way through my own call to action towards truth and reconciliation. And thanks to those that are putting into the chat where they are from as well. Thanks, Janine.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. Before we go any further, I'd like to help us get to know who the audience is by participating in a polling question for us, please. And then Noah's going to put up the polling questions for us. Please do take a minute or so, 30 seconds or so, just to scroll through. There's a slide at the bottom, at the side, just to kind of figure out, to scroll down through the questions. There are 4 questions. Are we at least 80% there, Noah?
No, we're about 68%.
Okay. All right.
And while we're waiting for that, Janine, I just want to point out that when you have something to share with everyone, please use the chat for that. The question and answers may only be available to the host, so using the chat would be helpful. Thanks.
All right. If we're at least 75%, we can share those results. Wonderful. So we've got quite a few elementary folks here with us today, as well as many of our principals, other staff as well. And we've got a great deal of folks with a lot of experience, and Southern and Central Ontario is fully represented. Awesome. All right, so thank you for choosing to be with us today. As we are Judith, Jose, and I appreciate your very busy role as vice principals and principals within our schools, particularly as the pandemic forces us to shift and pivot in many different directions over the last 2.5 years. We're grateful that you're giving yourself permission to take on your own professional learning. This is the 3rd and final webinar of this series, focusing on supporting students with autism. Today, we'll provide you with an opportunity to explore student voice and the importance of culturally relevant and responsive leadership strategies to support and incorporate the voice, identities, and lived experiences of students with autism. So like many things that we do within OPC here, we are focusing on working to include the voice of students. We're drawing on our leadership influence from within the Ontario Leadership Framework. Specifically today, we are looking at building trust in relationships, improving the instructional program, and in terms of our personal leadership resources, our cognitive resources. Building relationship and improving instruction for students does require the school principal and the vice principal to use their cognitive resources, particularly knowledge about school and classroom conditions that directly affect student learning and outcomes. So what are as we begin to unpack our own biases, we also need to understand the families and the students for which we serve. Culture goes much deeper than our typical understanding of ethnicity, race, or faith. It's also reflected in our students' multiple social identities, their ways of knowing and being in the world. So when we talk about cultural proficiency, we're talking about a set of values or behaviors or a set of policies and procedures that create appropriate approaches effectively to respond to issues around diversity as well as inclusion. Culturally proficient individuals may not know that they are, may not know everything that there is to know about others who are different from them. However, they're able to take advantage of teachable moments, to be able to ask questions without offending, and how to create an environment that is welcoming to diversity and change. Cultural proficiency is ideally what we want, right? How do you think about cultural proficiency and with explicit intention for students with autism? Or how do you enact and honor the voice of your school community? Those are all things that we need to consider. As we think about being culturally responsive leadership, what does that mean? So culturally responsive educators, we're talking about agents of social change. We're talking about working to remove barriers and creating conditions for learning. So this monograph here emphasizes how critical it is to acknowledge our students' multiple social identities and how they interact with the world. It's designed to provide educators with an understanding of teaching practices that engage students with a full range of differences in learning backgrounds, their strengths, and their areas for growth, as well as their interests. When we continue to think about culturally responsive leadership, we also think about incorporating equity leadership competences, consider leadership philosophies, practices, and policies that create inclusive schooling environments for students and families from ethnically and culturally diverse backgrounds. And also, what is that intersectionality with special education? We also need to think about the communities, right? To support marginalized students and communities who have become disengaged with schools. Principals and vice principals must reach out to students and their families to bring in that local community. In one context, you may be thinking about marginalized, in Toronto versus marginalized in other community areas. What does that mean in your context for you, for the students that you support? How have you identified local community organizations that support students with autism? Thinking about rural examples and how accessible are those organizations? And then is there a need for staff to engage? There is a need for staff to engage in ongoing critical self-assessment and reflections beyond just the personal, but also to challenge those systemic structures that often create inequitable environments. And we know when we're working within special education, there are structural or systemic practices that may be very harmful to students. Classroom conditions, as well as educators or students' critical consciousness needs to be built in order for us to ensure that resources are explored and they're meaningful to students. When conditions are not set and educators' critical consciousness are not built, even the greatest resources or the potential that we have can cause trauma. So we really have to be able to understand where we lie and what is our responsibility as administrators to actually be responsive to the needs of students. Along with thinking about how us as culturally responsive leaders, one of the things that we also have to think about is Learning for All, a document that's been around since 2013, and 10 years ago, it is still relevant today. Learning for All describes a set of beliefs based in research that should be used to guide program planning for students, for all students with special education needs included. Teachers planning programs or courses need to be able to pay attention to these beliefs, right? That all students can learn, that each student has their own unique patterns of learning, their strengths, their areas for growth, and their patterns of readiness. We are to assume responsibility and ownership for all students, and not just a student necessarily that we are asked to supervise within our classes, but as a school. What does the school community sort of look like? One of the things that we often state, or I often say, is that special education, it's not a destination, it's not a place to, we're aiming towards. It's really making sure that students are being supported in the best way possible. And I do think that Learning for All provides a foundation. When we think about Learning for All, we think about as administrators being culturally responsive, then we have to think about our learning conditions. And what does it mean when we think about the learning conditions for which we set? I like this visual because it really gives like a sort of stickler or really the different components that makes up how are we nurturing children. So when we talk about learning condition, it includes creating a balance, sort of explicit instruction, problem solving to whatever that zone of proximity that student is at in their own learning and growth, but also learning in flexible groupings. There's a lot of different components that make up how we are supporting students. So designing differentiated instruction enables our educators to provide personalized, precise teaching and learning experiences for all of our students. Each instructional strategy should take in place a safe, supportive, and stimulating environment, while considering that some students may require more systematic and intensive support, more explicit teaching before they're ready to take that independence or before they're ready to become independent, right? Classroom teachers need to support the larger community. So aside from just our own classroom, there's a school culture, the school community, and there's a larger community at large. And so we also want to be reminded that you also notice that a part of this building foundation, i.e. from the roots, is the relationship, and relationship and connection to people and to places is essential. I know, for example, we think about relationships in the Indigenous community, that is really important. And so we also want to be able to honor that when we talk about getting to know students. In order to teach them, you need to build relationships with them. Okay? As we continue to think about building that classroom environment, then that learning condition, we think about DStreaming and pathways for students with autism. Because as system leaders, as educators, support staff, all staff that are within the school, we need to address our own biases and assumptions about students, about student barriers and what those barriers might be. And we need to dismantle that within our classroom and outside of our classroom. So the purpose of DStreaming is to support that cultural shift in schools that will identify and dismantle systemic discrimination and structural inequities. The new grade 9 math course, which replaces a grade 9 academic and applied course, is being taught in our school in Ontario since September of this year. So it's new this year, and schools are gathering data around how is that really working for students. Many students have gone through, it could have been a quadmester or a full semester to actually get some data about who the students are, but it's certainly designed to bring in more of learning experience for all students. It's meant to be enriched. We have new topics in there like coding, data, and financial literacy. And when you think about that, and you think about for students with autism, knowing the students' cultural and linguistics background, their strengths, their interests, their motivation, all that, regardless if it's math or the new curriculum, science, or I hear they're also thinking of revamping the language curriculum as well. Whenever we think about the curriculum being DStreamed and where you have a course, how are we thinking about the students in your school with autism or special education? How is streaming still continuing informally based on classroom groupings or classroom settings? So who are those students as you analyze your own school data for this year? Who are the students that were that have been accommodated or have been provided with modifications or that are passing or not passing? Those are information that you're able to then think about as we move forward. One of the things as we continue to think about that is the collaboration. So how are special education teachers or our special education resource teachers, your assistant curriculum leaders, your curriculum leaders, your POR positions of responsibility, how are they collaborating with classroom and core or subject teachers? Every time we think about an assessment, it is really about teaching point, right? How do we use assessment as liberation, not as ways to rank and to classify students into what category should they be in academic or should they be in applied, but how do you really be able to now make accommodations for students and to be able to use a variety of resources to support students. So the teaching and learning process does involve ongoing assessment. Students with special education needs should be provided with various opportunities to demonstrate their learning and thinking in multiple ways. Apologies for 1 second. Apologies. So in planning, in program planning, and when we think about students or courses, we have to, the teachers have to understand, and they have to know the students in order to make appropriate accommodations or modifications. So they have to be able to know what the curriculum is. So the new math course, the new geography, not geography, rather science curriculum, the addendums to the grade 10 math courses, all of those pieces still needs to be, teachers need to understand that. And once they understand, they're able to make those necessary accommodations that's needed. When we think about as I've mentioned, accommodations or modifications, providing students with accommodations should be the first options as we think about supporting students, right? Instructions based on the principles of universal design for learning or differentiated instructions are good because we're able to meet the diverse learners in our classrooms. And we know that regardless of, if it's an intensive support program or a regular classroom, students vary in terms of their own needs in the classroom. Not everyone is always at the same level at any rate. So many students are able to, once provided with accommodations, participate in the regular grade or the course and demonstrate their learning independently. An accommodation allows for a student to access the curriculum without changes to the curriculum. And that's the key piece, is that we're providing opportunities for them to access that curriculum equitable like their peers. You know that there are 3 types of instructional, 3 types of accommodations. We've got instructional accommodations in terms of what practices, what teaching practices we're using. You got your environmental accommodations, and some of that environmental accommodations may come right into play when we think about the new curriculums like the DStreamed math or science, for example. And when we talk about assessment, again, assessment is key to learning. When we focus on assessment for learning and as learning, you get a lot more buy-in from students. And if you look at the variety of ways that students can be accommodated, that is what we need to look at and will help in terms of our DStreams classes. In terms of modifications, when we think about modifications, we are talking about changes to either the numbers or the complexity of the expectation. And with modification, I think the key piece, and even within secondary, any course can be modified. It really, in secondary, it becomes to the point of the integrity of the credit. So we modify to what degree does that student still earn the credit, or they don't earn the credit. But at the same time, in elementary, we can make modification. In secondary, we can also make modification, and we are changing those expectations. And again, like I said, to the degree to which the student is going to earn that credit is where the differences come into play with our secondary. So how do we respond to understanding and continuing to ensure that the voice of students come into play? So there are strategies we're going to talk about a few strategies to respond to student voice and DStreaming. And so when we think about these specific strategies for administrators, majority of student need can be met with these strategies. We're talking about inclusive design, and we'll talk briefly about these, but any one of these here could absolutely be a morning session or a full 2-hour session, more deep in depth. We also have universal design for learning. And I think differentiated instruction as well over 10 years ago is misunderstood in terms of many people say, yeah, I'm doing this. A universal design is not something I train you on in a day and I give it to you and I go. It's the principle of how we're designing our lessons, but we'll speak more about that in a short bit. And then of course, tiered approach, which three of these strategies can already be found in Learning for All. And the other 6 hours of inclusive design, it's more recent, but certainly they're both all worthy strategies for which you can implement at any point within your school. Sorry. Thank you. The noise was, I couldn't hear myself. All right. So the first part that I want to talk about is inclusive design. And inclusive design provides a way to challenge persistent gaps faced by marginalized. And when I say marginalized, oftentimes it's students with special education needs that are considered marginalized. But we know there are other, in your context of your school, what your data shows you, who are those students that are marginalized. So we certainly, it uses an integrated design approach that is tied to the school improvement process to assist with measuring and monitoring of your school improvement plan. So as you can see already, inclusive design is not something that you just take, I give you training on in a day or two, and then off you go and you're doing it. It's embedded in, it's a process for which you use to be able to think about or design when you're thinking about what your goals are for your school improvement plan. There are 6 threads to inclusive design. They're all equally important. And it is done through a lot of questions, and the questions allow for many different participants to enter into that journey of thinking about and supporting students through an anti-oppression approach. So the 6 threads include designing instruction. So you're thinking specifically about your instructional practice. You engage in your parents, your families, your elders, and communities. Establishing an environment as a third teacher, building staff leadership capacity, analyzing data, and responding to student voice. At the core of inclusive design is anti-oppressive approach that encourages educators to think about the impact of their actions and whether or not the structures are supporting or harming students. So what structures do you currently have in place in your school to support students with special education needs, for example, and how in your goal of reading or your goal of writing or numeracy, how do they intersect? So most importantly, it encourages us to understand the necessity of equity as a leadership competency, as well as to use that to drive student achievement and well-being. So in most cases, inclusive design should be used everywhere in your classrooms. It's a process, and it's not something, like I said, you just pick up and here you go, you have it. So when for today's purpose, I'm going to touch very briefly on responding to student voice and establishing the environment as a third teacher. So in terms of, I want you to think about your role as a principal and vice principal, and within your own context, right? Your own school environment, your school community. Think about how an inclusive design approach as a process for planning can support you in your work in supporting students with autism or students in special education. So because the whole point of inclusive design is, when you notice in some of the questions, it puts students at the center of the conversation and ask our educators ourselves to consider who children are, what are their lived experiences, what are their abilities, what are their needs, and what stories that they bring to the table, and who is most marginalized and who's benefiting, who's being successful, who is not being successful in schooling, and why. And then you begin to design an improvement plan that can have all these in mind in order to ensure that students are successfully being supported. It really does require deepening understanding of how to design learning for students, learning materials, right? What are the resources that we're using? And it's asking the question and think about those resources. How are you using those resources? It also asks you to think about your environment, because your environment, as we say in terms of the environment as a third teacher, what does the environment say about the students that are there, and how do students feel welcomed in that particular environment as well? So when we are thinking about responding to student voice, how are you considering these questions? Questions that I have up here on the screen that you can see. How do you encourage and support student voice? How do you draw upon a student voice, the realities? How do we ensure students have input into decisions? So when we think about these, how do we encourage and support student voice? Right? Share vision and include them in executing those visions. They matter, formal and informal ways. There are many, doesn't always have to be that formal, like a survey. There's other ways that we can engage students. So what evidence-based approaches are we using to encourage and ensure that students have input into decisions and their voice? How are we using them as agent, like they are, how do we use their voice and agency as it relates to school improvement? Because they're in this environment, living it day to day. Sometimes we do many things onto students, but we need to include them so that they feel a part of that school environment. Sometimes it's harder than it seems, all right? I'm not going to sit here and just talk at you and say, you can do this, but it is harder than it seems, but that's the work, right? We have to engage students and find a way to do that. So how do we draw upon their voices and the realities of students to make responsive programming decision? We have diagnostics, right? Assessments that we do with surveys, with class circles, we have restorative, like there's a lot of different things that we do and that may, within different boards that we may do that actually engages students. And that's what we want you to think about when you hear the voice of students, how do you respond? It's one thing to have a survey out, but how do you actually show that you're listening to the voices of students, that we're not just doing it for the sake of, hey, we've put a survey out to our students. How have we considered students' identities and cultural ways of knowing and supporting programming, mental health and well-being? What can we do to help experience success for students, encourage students to advocate for themselves? Many of our students with special education needs may not have that self-advocacy skills in terms of being able to speak to their teachers about what their needs are. We want to continue to build on equity-based classroom. And when I say that, what does that mean when I say equity-based classroom? What is equity? And those are things that we want you to think about and ask of our question, because sometimes we say a lot of things, but we really need to make sure that teachers understand what we are saying. And then, of course, we want to always focus on perspectives, discuss our biases and barriers that may be in play. We want students to identify their own. We want conferences that are happening as well. Focus on student thinking, metacognition, them reflecting and thinking about their own thinking as well. So there are many ways that we continue to think about students. As we think about students' voice, who they are, I'm reminded about neurodiversity. And this coming from our colleague, Stefan, who's been with us through the journey. And one of the things that he brought to our attention is when we talk about neurodiversity, the idea that students or people with all sort of variety of neural function deserve to be valued, of course, treated with dignity. And we think about our human rights policy and have their rights respected as self-determining individuals. So even when, and this is the key, even when we know that some of them have very high needs, okay? So they are this advocacy, or we're advocating for a model of service based on differences, right? And not on the deficit. So we want to shift that paradigm shift from having a medical model, but more of a social model, right? Our schools are here to, we're here to support students and again, respect them in determining their own rights. So when we think about neurodiversity, I want us to think about the fact that neurodiversity is a worldview instead interrogates the assumptions of dominant cultural ways of being that are not, in the words of one of the activists, Joyce Davidson, thinks about autism compatibility. So especially when we think about expectations of social behavior, right? So what behaviors are socially acceptable? Or are we talking about students or people's abilities, right? So we need to make sure that we understand, for example, students with autism often prefer a single channel of communication. And for the example, it's very written or it could be verbal, because sometimes having both then allows them to activate both sort of understanding the nuances of having a conversation, that wait time that perhaps might not be there, the other pieces that come in when you're having a dialogue with individuals. Those are definitely things that I think that we also need to consider. Along with that, we also talked about, or Stefan, also brings the point that when we are speaking to students, families around with autism, what language do we use in those conversations, and how do we see those people, those families when we are communing with? Does our language suggest that people or students with autism lack something, right? Are we using our language to unnecessarily medicalize autism when describing educational supports? These are things that questions that we want you to continue, well, that we're asking for you to consider when you're speaking to families and students with autism. Am I using words or phrases that that traditionally you would have used in this particular field of education, for example? Does your language unofficially or necessarily other people, like the other in and those students or students or families over there? So I think we need to make sure that our language does not suggest that the average person, that the goal of instructional practice is behavioral or control or normalization, right? We need to be able to give as much autonomy to our students with autism and to our families. We need to listen to our families as well. Now, in considering or think about your board and think about the structures within your board, one of the things that comes to mind is transition. So elementary or secondary, transition plays a key role for students' successful entry into school, early entry into school, going from elementary to secondary or post-secondary. When we think about students, these are some of the things that students have said to us, right, in terms of their transition, and how are we listening to those and thinking about neurodiversity. They should, one of the students stated, they should know about the different clubs that you can join and tell us about. So this is what students are thinking about. My grade 8 teacher wanted me to try to figure things out by myself, asking for help. Before I asked for help, she said that was how it was in high school. It can be very hard to make friends. I get picked up and taken home by the school bus. So I don't get to do some of the after school stuff like some of our other schools. So when we think about clubs, we think about activities that are happening after school. Of course, we're in the pandemic in terms of how things can happen, but there are ways that virtually students can participate. But those are things that, you know, a student who is being bussed into the school, it's very hard. And especially when you might be in rural areas and different boards, that's also something to consider. Like, what do we do? How can we support students who might want to stay for after school, but at the same time, you have the challenge with the busing. Students have also said, I wish I had the chance to meet my, I wish I've had the chance to meet my teachers before the new school year. Or I think grade 8 teachers can help a lot when they have a good handle upon the student's main interest, or then they can help identify the best school options for us. So these are just some of the things that students are saying. The step is not a big one as it seems for some students. Sometimes I find the workload a little hard. I enjoy being treated more maturely as a young adult. I don't miss some of the nonsense that some of my peers got up to in grade 7 and 8. So again, students, like anyone else, they mature, they go experience, the puberty, going through many different challenges as their typical peers. One of the things that I love this quote here, it reminds us that nonverbal communication is just as important, and we all need to be mindful of what we unintentionally value when we think about student voice, right? So body language, our smiles, our eye contact, our voice, our tone, our facial expression, adaptive technology, assistive technologies. These are all important ways that students who are nonverbal use to communicate. And we also need to pay attention to that, because while we think about student voice, oftentimes some students with autism are not able to express that in the way that our typical peers can. However, it's still valued, and we need to be able to find a way to tap into how they too share their voice and their experiences. Other comments that have come forward as well is around self-determination. So and this comes back to when we talk about neurodiversity and students with autism and various neuro functioning, want to be self-determined, right? I want to be me and not you. I'm autistic and I'm proud. I don't understand why the teacher doesn't talk to me. I want to be able to make choices that reflects who I am. I have dreams like everyone else. I do have emotions and empathy. Teachers talk too much. So these are things that students have actually, said. And if we took some time to hear what they've said, we can actually, really hear what some of their needs are. In addition, in terms of thinking about how do we create an invitational environment. So one of the things when we talk about inclusive design, I said the establishing the environment as the third teacher. Well, how do you create an environment or class culture where families and students see themselves valued, reflected, and feel a part of the process of learning? And when we say see themselves, is in the curriculum, in the material, the resources that we're using to teach, how do they see themselves there? And how do we use the experiences of our students in that environment? We value everyone as a learner, right? And we continue to foster positive relationships with families and partnership with staff, students, parents, and of course, the community at large. Safe adult and a safe space in the building is required, right? Students need to feel that there is a safe space or a caring adult for whom they can turn to. When you are considering the environment as the third teacher, you also want to consider what are the social barriers to access? How do you support engagement opportunities? Do students see diversity and equity represented widely throughout the school environment or even within their classroom? Are there other students like them in the class? And this is one of the things I mentioned before in terms of, in that DStreamed math class, DStreamed science, or other subject areas for which schools have provided DStreamed classes, who are the students in those classes? And are there other students like them in those classes as well? When we talk about students with autism, we're talking about a gamut of students on the spectrum, right? You've got students that are nonverbal, students that are very high functioning. It varies. And across the province, in many different boards, you may have intensive support programs, you may not. And so what does that look like in your own context when a student says, I never see anybody else like me in the school, or I never see anyone like me in any of my classes? Now, what do we do? Like, is that something that we're unconsciously streaming in some way? But certainly we need to look at how do we celebrate events and include students with special education needs. Is there an equity committee at the school or wellness committee, or does any banners or things that you have up, does it reflect the diversity of students in your building? Bulletin boards, are there various bulletin boards that are around in your building? Sometimes it doesn't take a lot of huge planning. It really does, the smallest little things that would really show that engagement or thinking about students. Is there explicit connections between the students' identities, abilities, their lived experiences? Because students, they come to us with so much experience. I remember visiting classrooms and just talking with students. You learn so much from them. It's a pleasure, and I miss that opportunity, in fact, of working in the classroom with students, because they bring rich conversations that you can actually lead off from and use as teachable moments within the classroom as well. So what approaches have you utilized to ensure that the environment is intentionally being created to invite, reflect, and support students and their families from whatever communities that you have across your school and your community? So I want you to think about that as well. In regards to the creating supportive learning environment and thinking about that third teacher, today's classrooms are, they've changed over time. Slowly, believe it or not, I've seen some not so much rows anymore, and I've seen group, etc. Yes, I want to consider the pandemic, and it has I was a bit scary at first, because I think the pandemic sort of brought back on that, rows of desks and because the physical distances, etc. But certainly pre-pandemic, we were heading towards more of a collaborative work, right? Where there's more choices in the classroom, resources, where a student can work, how they can work. You see sometimes in classrooms, you have, those beanbag chairs, comfortable environment, believe it or not, makes a difference for some of our students with autism. So why are visuals effective? Well, students with autism have difficulty, not all, okay, and I don't want to paint the picture that I know everything about every student with autism, but certainly many students with autism have difficulty following verbal instructions. This often occurs with students who have a difficult time processing verbal information and perhaps have low working memory. Creating predictability, it eases the anxiety that most students with autism may feel when they're unsure what activities are coming next. So visual scheduling really does help that. What their day looks like and whether or not there will be any changes in that day. And sometimes social stories help that, in particular if there's going to be changes and the classroom teacher, you're going to be absent for a day. For some students, no warning causes real anxiousness for that particular child. We want to increase independence of students, right? That's our goal, is to make sure we have, critical thinkers, but also we want to increase students' independence. So teachers can use visuals to prompt the students by simply pointing to the direction. They don't necessarily have to be using a lot of words. Some students prefer not to hear the teacher a lot, and the visuals will do. Others may need the chunking, right? The step-by-step instructions slowly in order to get the instructions that they need for next. So things for you to consider. Discuss with the classroom, the core teacher, and embed that in some professional learning. Is some students may have learned a skill, like what materials they need to get from one area of the school to the other, or get something from their desk to complete an activity, but may not be able to remember them all. So they can do it, but they just may not remember it. Sometimes that visual really does help them to proceed. Some students may also have incredible sensitivity to light, or it could be the sound. So if you think about a science class busy, or you think about a math class, and you think about that class and that they have students in there with autism and it's right by the washroom, you know how sometimes a fan is very loud in the washroom. You and I may be able to, ignore that, but some students with autism, they really do pick up that sensory. And so those are, when you think about your classroom environment, you have to think about where certain classes are perhaps in order to engage the students a little bit more. So those are things that I think it's, it's something that you want to think about. And when you're thinking about the environment for where classes are located in your school, first floor, second floor, science. I mean, sometimes you may not have choices because the science lab may have specific resource or material that is needed, but certainly those are things that, and depending on the number of students you have in your school with autism, you may have to be looking at a different environment in order to set up the environment for their learning. The other strategy is when we talk about universal design for learning. And I think this sometimes people misunderstand what universal design for learning is, because it's not a thing that I give to you. It's the principle of designing, and it comes from a CAST website, which is the reference you'll see when you get a copy of the PowerPoint there. And it really was, there's a history behind it. Like I said, we can have a whole entire session on universal design for learning. So universal design for learning is a principle used in teaching and learning strategies that meet the needs of all students when planning instructions for students. So you're designing your instruction. It helps teachers to develop their curricular that is accessible for all students, regardless of their ability. Right? So help teachers consider individual learning needs in a way that allows them to plan one lesson, one curricula that every student can access. So if I'm planning a lesson, for example, and with that lesson, I may then record a piece of that lesson because I know many students are going to come back and ask me questions about that. So I may record that. I have to consider upfront when I'm designing the lesson, where students situated in terms of accessibility in the classroom. So there are three different principles or three different areas. And first is the multiple means of engagement. So representation, how students are learning, how they're learning, and stimulates motivation, sustain enthusiasm. So that's where you have the first part, the first principle. The second one is the multiple means of representation. So learners differ in ways that they perceive and understand the information that is presented to them. So for example, those with sensory disabilities or sensory needs, thinking about students who are blind, or visually impaired rather, the students with learning disabilities, you can consider how you want to represent the information for them to be able to absorb that lesson. And then of course you have your multiple means, which is your action and expression, meaning learners differs in the way that they can navigate learning environment and express what they know. So how are we providing an opportunity in the design of our lessons for students to demonstrate what is it that they're learning? So it could be, they can express themselves in a written format. They can express themselves using speech. It should also be recognized that when we're talking about their actions and expression, it requires strategy, it requires practice, because the first time you do, the first time you might do a speech, you may be quiet, but if you rehearse and practice a lot, you get better at it, right? So essentially, the universal design is a blueprint for creating flexible goals, methods, materials, assessment, and accommodation for the various learners. It aids in the planning process. It's not a thing that we can give to teachers and say here. It really is the principle of how you think about students and their learning when you're designing your lessons, okay? This just shows some examples of universal design for learning, that you have interactive writing, narrated work, puppet, like just various ways that you can design how you are instructing and teaching students in order to get the best out of them, because they have it in them. It's our job to make sure that we find a way for them to show us what they know and demonstrate what they're learning. Now, when we universal design for learning, like I said before, it stems from design, in which architect, if you look at the CAST website, it really does give you a really good foundation. One of the pictures that always stick to me is that ramp. There's a cartoon image of a student asking the caretaker, I think a facility staff, it's a snowstorm and they're just clearing the stairs, and the student was in a wheelchair and they asked, can you clear the ramp? Because once you clear that ramp, everybody can use that ramp, rather than clearing the stairs first. Then that student in the wheelchair still has to wait until the ramp is cleared. So it's just thinking about the design and how you want to ensure that all are involved in it. When you think about your curricular design, your materials, all of it needs to be is considered when you think about that design, that universal design approach. It reduces barriers for learning. It really does provide access for all students. It encourages self-efficacy for students, increases student engagement, and it empowers students, right? And ensures that we are adhering to Ontario Human Rights Code in terms of accessibility for all students. Now, I swear 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when differentiated came out, many staff say, or teachers would say, yeah, we're doing differentiated instruction. And it really, it isn't. Like, when you really think about differentiated, so to accommodate and respond to diverse learners. So it is based on the idea that students, because students differ significantly in their interest, their learning styles, their readiness, our teaching strategies should also differ, right? Because we are trying to meet the needs of students as we are teaching. So in order to do that, teachers must provide a variety of ways for all students to feel affirmed and to be challenged in the classroom, right? Differential instruction is student-centered and it is effective, and all students have the opportunity to succeed from their individual points of entry. So how does it work? Well, you are differentiate mainly your three different things. The content, right? You're differentiating the process, and you're differentiating the product in terms of what you expect from students. And when we say you're differentiating, when you use universal design for learning, you plan that in your lesson, then you're planning to use differentiation. So, and it is a high yield instructional strategy that has been around for a number of years. And I think that we just haven't given it enough justice. This is certainly something that is talked about in Learning for All. And I do believe that if we can change how we are expecting students to learn by how we as educators present information or teach students, and we have a far better chance of reaching them in much effective ways. UDL proactively evaluates the classroom instruction and environment and provides access to content on the upfront matter. When we think about, we talk about appropriately designed space, clear link to the environment as the third teacher, because again, you want to pull up on that environment in order to design your lessons. And there's lots of flexibility according to student strength and areas for growth. When we talk about differentiated instruction, you can see that, it reactively evaluates individual students and retrofits and modifies on the back end, right? The specific instructional strategies is what DI would focus on, and where you've got universal as your principle of how am I going to design that lesson, right? They're both in terms of approaches. They both could be in looking at the various ways that we assess students as well. They're just different ways that we can certainly access for students.
Janine, Janine, it's Judith, just letting you know that we're at 4 minutes.
Okay, sorry. Oh, this is very good. So the last one, which I won't spend too much on, but it is in our tiered approach, is the, in Learning for All is tiered approach. And when we talk about tiered approach, we're talking about what is good for all, good for some, and a few. And in many cases, there are strategies that we can certainly implement that will be able to support all learners. The last piece here is responding to student voice. As educators, we're open to student voice, right? One of the things that I will say that student voice refers to the values, right? Their opinions, our beliefs, perspectives, cultural background of individual students and the group of students in a school, and to instructional approaches and techniques that are based on student choice, interest, passion, and ambitions. We really do have to find a way to embed their voice into our curriculum and how we are instructing and teaching students. This was from a student voice transforming relationship ministry capacity series that I think it's worthwhile to have a look at. So essentially, in a study done with students that are students with autism, the teaching style was reported as a significant area in that affected their engagement with what was required of them. Teaching style, individual student interests, they wanted to make sure that when the teachers knew who they were, that it was incorporated into their lessons, as well as participating in the school, in the experience, the culture of the school. When they felt they were included, they were certainly more open to being engaged, right? So students with autism are being asked to draw upon a continuous amounts of resilience and determination to participate well in school life. Hence, careful consideration must be given to our day-to-day interactions to support their well-being and successful practice in inclusion. I'll leave you with this last quote. A key takeaway from this webinar is when we are working with students and families, voice matters, and creating a school culture where students feel they matter and belong is extremely important. How do you view students with autism, and how are they contributed to how can we use their voices in order to contribute to your school improvement plan to ensure that their successes are also tracked and monitored as well. We ask that you consider how you lead from a culturally responsive leadership stance and truly put students at the center of everything that we do and every decisions that we make. And I'll leave you with this quote: an autistic person's effort to self-advocate are useless if they're ignored, invalidated, or result in getting in trouble. Self-advocacy attempts with the lack of responsive partner further ingrain autistic people that their needs aren't worth it. And we need to change that. We have a real real opportunity to ensure that students with autism, not just autism, but students with special education needs, are valid and that they're seen, their voices are heard within your school community as well. We do have a quick poll at the end that we ask you to respond to in terms of the session for today or in our series. Thank you very much again for your participation this hour. I do apologize for the noise in the beginning, and the slide deck will be available for you and will be sent out to you. And there are other series that have been posted throughout. You can check out OPC as well as your organizations. I do thank you very much for giving us your time for this afternoon. If you have any questions, please do send them our way and we'll try to answer them as best as we can.
Thanks so much, Janine, for this preparation, for this webinar and all the preparation that went into it, including your conversations with Stefan, your work with Judith and Jose. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the final 9 of 9, as it may be. And so really grateful for all three of you, along with Luciana, who is not here, and Pierre, who does the support for the ADFO for the French webinars. So I think, you know, the quality of the webinars that we've been able to host over the past 3 years has been largely due to your continued engagement and your continued involvement and your wanting to continue to support principals. And, you know, I was reading through the chat as we were going, and I acknowledge that we have work to do. We absolutely do. But this has been a good experience and a good start to some of that work, and we'll keep working on it because there is always room for improvement. And I think that some of the comments in the chat give us some direction in which we can go. So really grateful for those. It might be, I know that usually you get the email with the bundle and everything the day of or the day after, but as I mentioned, Sarah is no longer with OPC, and we have not yet completed the hiring process for someone else to take over Sarah's responsibilities. And so it might be a little bit delayed, but you will get it for sure. And it will go up on each of the association websites. Jose, can you remind me when the French one is or was?
It is on March 30th.
Okay, perfect. So the French resources will be available on all association websites as well. So if you go to the OPC website, you'll notice that what we do is we post the English resources and we also post the French resources, including the link to the French one. So if there are ever some information pieces that you would like to share with parents or share with staff in French immersion programs, for example, or other French language stakeholders, then you have that ability, and you don't have to search for the information on ADFO's website. It's there for you on OPC, and I believe CPCO does the same. So trying to make the information as accessible as possible. So I don't know if I have to go to another meeting. I'm late and I've started seeing emails pop in that people can't get into the room. So I don't know, Judith and Jose, if you have a few final words. I'm going to step out, and thank you, Noah, for your support here.
Thanks, Nadine. Janine, I just want you to know there was a lot of conversation happening and a lot of sharing in the chat, and we can take a look at that at a different time, but it was very engaging. I thank those that engaged with me through that and for sharing the resources that they have as well from their perspective. So that was helpful. Thank you. It's been a pleasure working with the two of you, and Stefan, of course, who couldn't be here today. And I'll turn it to you, Jose.
Same for me. A big thank you to everyone for taking time out of your very busy day to be with us. And Judith and Janine, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm just going to miss this work so much, but maybe there'll be a year 4. We can hope.
There we go. Thank you all.
Right,
Enjoy.
Did you want to